Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. And today we're finally going to get into the Watergate scandal and what ended President Nixon's presidency. Learning targets today. Before we get to Watergate, we're going to discuss Nixon's domestic policy and specifically his Southern strategy, or his strategy to win Southern Republican votes. And then we'll get into the Watergate incident itself, its outcomes, and the reforms that followed. So Nixon wins 1972 re-election in a landslide, and we'll talk about that a little more in-depth later. But he claims he's speaking for the silent majority again, and we already talked about that. Those in Middle America who aren't hippies, who aren't protesting, who just go about their everyday lives, and for the most part are normal. Also, during his second term, starting in 1973, he's going to give power back to the states in a program that he calls New Federalism, because all throughout the U.S. history, the federal government has become much more powerful. But while giving power back to the states, he also expands the federal government's role. And we've talked about OSHA and the Environmental Protection Agency, and he also starts the DEA, or the Drug Enforcement Administration. So while expanding the federal government's role, he's giving power back to the states. So it's kind of a contradiction. Stagflation is a term that is coined during this time, and it's basically rising unemployment plus rising inflation. So prior to the 1970s, these two things were assumed to never rise together, but due to the large Vietnam War budget and the rising foreign competition for jobs, especially in the auto industry, and a supply shock, such as a dramatic increase in the price of oil, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They're basically a cartel. We learned about cartels when we first semester, but it's mostly made up of Arab nations. And the U.S., all through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, is becoming more and more dominated by suburbs. And we learned that the auto industry and the availability of automobiles basically makes that possible. So more oil is needed to heat homes and power cars. Oil, during this time, starts to become a way for third world countries to influence larger, more powerful nations like the United States. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but basically later in the 70s, a huge oil shock will happen, and we won't have as much oil. So Nixon in civil rights, it's kind of a mixed bag. He appeals to both whites and minorities. So he starts winning support from blue-collar workers and Southern whites. Think about Southern whites before. They hated Lincoln, who was a Republican, and they voted Democrat ever since then. So had blue-collar workers. So his Southern strategy is winning support from those people. And how he did it is he called for a freeze on court-ordered busing. And court-ordered busing was, even if everybody in your school district was white and you had an all-white school just de facto, you still had to bus in black students and integrate that school. So Nixon calls for a freeze on this practice, and he also appoints conservative Southerners judges. And so whites like this. Nixon also starts to require labor unions and federal contractors to submit goals and plans for hiring minorities. And this is the other side of the coin. This appeals to minorities. This is known as affirmative action, which is any policy that gives special consideration to women and minorities in education and employment. So even if a white man is more qualified than a black man, the black man still may get the job since he is a minority. And this is supposed to make up for any sort of past discrimination these people have gone through. So again, the election of 1972, Nixon wins in a landslide over George McGovern. The electoral vote isn't even close, 520 to 17. Nixon wins 49 states. He misses D.C. and Massachusetts. He wins 60.7% of the popular vote, which is unheard of. and he's the first Republican presidential candidate to sweep every southern state, which proves that his southern strategy works. Now we finally get to Watergate, and Watergate is the name of a hotel in Washington, and it's the general term for the series of scandals involving Nixon and his administration. And it all starts with a break-in to the Watergate Hotel, or the Watergate Complex, where the Democratic National Committee headquarters are at on June 17, 1972. These people are caught, and they are indicted by a grand jury. And these 7 men are found out to be a member of CREEP, or Nixon's Committee to Re-elect the President. And this scandal also reveals the existence of a White House, what they call a dirty tricks squad. So that's why they called President Nixon Tricky Dick. And because his first name was Richard as well. The plumbers, there were men who plugged political leaks or who discredited journalists, discredited other people who who told the truth about Nixon, but if their credibility is attacked, then nobody's going to believe them. So the goal of this was political sabotage of all of Nixon's enemies. So the U.S. Senate sets up a committee, they can do that, to investigate. And they uncover the connection between the break-in and CREEP. And 2 young, brash Washington Post reporters named Woodward and Bernstein, they uncover information suggesting that knowledge of this break-in goes as far as the FBI, the CIA, the Justice Department, and even Nixon himself in the White House. So they have a source that they only reveal in 2005 after he dies, that it was the deputy director of the FBI. So another committee is set up to investigate the White House staff, since they uncovered that knowledge went to the White House staff. Meanwhile, Spiro Agnew, the vice president, resigns, according to a completely different scandal. And the recently passed 25th Amendment states that if the vice president cannot fulfill his duties due to resignation or death, the president picks a new one with congressional approval. So this new Senate committee, through investigating the White House staff, reveals that there is a recording system in the White House in the Oval Office. So they want to hear these tapes, and they subpoena Nixon for the tapes, which basically means he has to hand them over. But he still refuses, citing something called executive privilege, that the president and the executive department has the right to keep certain information confidential if it's in the interest of national security. And so along the way, Nixon's whole cabinet is crumbling. He dismisses and fires Archibald Cox, and then the attorney general and deputy attorney general resign. He refuses to hand over the whole tapes, but he eventually releases edited portions, and he claims the edited portions are crucial to national security, whereas they really just prove his guilt. And so this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And in U.S. versus Nixon, they rule that the claim of executive privilege over these tapes were void. They don't reveal national secrets. So Nixon has to hand over the tapes. The content is revealed. It's revealed that he did know about the break-in, and he did take part in the cover-up of the break-in. So Congress begins to think about impeaching the president. Is this a treason, bribery, high crime, or misdemeanor? That's the definition of impeachment from the Constitutions. And impeachment is bringing a civil officer up on charges for conduct committed while in office. There's only been 2 presidents in history to be impeached: Andrew Johnson in the 1860s and Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Nixon learns that there's enough Republican votes to impeach him, so on August 8th, 1974, Nixon announces that he'll resign at noon on the next day, and then Vice President Gerald Ford will become the next president. And he is the only president that was never elected vice president and never elected president. He got put in office by the 25th Amendment. So Watergate is a huge political scandal. It runs to the deepest parts of the government and the highest levels of administration. Think about this. Put this in the context of the American people at that point. We've been defeated in Vietnam. We have a weakening economic position with the rise of all of our former friends who we helped get out of World War II are now becoming economic powers, and increasing social conflict within the U.S. And this basically leads to a lack of trust between politicians and the people they represent. So here's basically a review, causes and effects of the Watergate crisis. And here are some reforms to prevent further abuses of power. The Federal Election Campaign Act amendments basically sets limits on campaign contributions and creates the Federal Election Commission. Freedom of Information Act amendments, Government in the Sunshine Act, and Ethics in Government Act of 1978. So make sure you know what those are. Make sure you know how Watergate affects government and makes it more open, and people distrust politicians, especially after Watergate. Fill out your learning targets, and I will see you here back in class. Bye-bye.